This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules that together comprise our lecture covering the article by Laurence BonJour entitled, Can Empirical Knowledge Have Foundations? Before we turn our attention to BonJour's article, let's take a moment to get our bearings in terms of where we've been, where we are, and in general where we're going in our class. So we begin the class by reading and discussing two classic texts in epistemology. We looked at Plato's Theaetetus and we looked at Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. And we studied those texts and talked about those texts in part to get an understanding of what those theorists thought and the theories that they forwarded and the arguments that they offered in favor of their theories. We also tried to develop a sense of these sorts of problems, the concepts, the theories, and the methodologies that together would help us to frame and understand the epistemic enterprise in philosophy in general. And we definitely saw that coming to fruition after we read Descartes' Meditations, and then in the following week, we turned our attention in the readings and lectures on information ecosystems to a contemporary practical application that was very much concerned with and illustrative of the basic sort of skeptical concerns that Descartes raises in a much more dramatic but possibly rhetorical fashion when he argues for external world skepticism. We saw in the information ecosystems that human beings develop these elaborate information prostheses, these collections of sources, senses, individuals, mechanisms, and instruments, institutions that facilitate gathering information and sharing information. And we noticed that human beings are very good at creating these systems, but that these systems, in addition to the tremendous benefits they provided, also introduced a significant amount of risk and difficulty. And we talked about a number of different difficulties, not the least of which was that when we gather information from these very large networks of other individuals, of institutions, of instrumentation, and so on, that this relatively heavy dependence we have on information provided to us in a relatively anonymous fashion by individuals that we don't have any direct contact with for the most part, creates a sort of situation that in many ways is similar to the situation that Descartes contemplates when he tries to distinguish, right, whether within his own experiences he can really determine whether or not the source of his information, this beneficent or maleficent deity, is going to be giving him good information or bad information about the world. In this set of readings for this week and the lectures that accompany it, we now turn our attention to less applied and more theoretic concerns. We'll return to Descartes' theory about foundationalism, and we'll look at that as a theory of justification. We'll look at the criticisms that BonJour offers up, the alternative theory that BonJour espouses, called coherentism, and we'll get a better sense, I think, of the fundamental difficulties that we can trace all the way back to Plato's Theaetetus, but that certainly are very prominent even in these modern formulations of theories about the nature of justification that we find in contemporary epistemology in the 80s and early 90s. Now, our lecture on BonJour is going to be structured in much the way that BonJour structures the paper. BonJour has 2 theses in his paper, and we'll break the lecture into 2 major components, one dealing with each of the 2 theses. The first thesis articulates what BonJour refers to as the fundamental problem or challenge that both motivates and undermines, in his mind, foundationalism as a theory of justification, namely the problem of epistemic regress, and how BonJour then uses that problem to outline or articulate a couple of different variations of foundationalism, and then in his second thesis subject those variants of foundationalism to critical scrutiny to determine if in fact they are capable of addressing the very problem that they introduce as their central motivation for adopting foundationalism as a theory of justification.